crisis that exists within Somalia, and it's a long shot process. There's no doubt about it. But it's finally beginning to try to address that. Until they do that, really, you could send in thousands and thousands of UN troops, and it wouldn't make any difference, as we saw in the 1990s.
Well, let's squeeze in a call before we take a break. Bashir is on the line from London. Bashir, what would you like to ask?
Thanks, Riz. My question is, Ethiopia is our prime enemy, to be honest, and that's through history. And fighting against Ethiopia is a terrorism. And what is the actual result?
Okay, Jeffrey Gettleman, if I could get to you there in Nairobi. Of course, the issue of Ethiopia comes up again. I guess we could just quickly look at the role Eritrea is playing in this, because again, Eritrea has been implicated in supporting the Islamic courts.
A lot of people think this issue connects back to the divide between Eritrea and Ethiopia, and they've been arguing about this border that has been demarcated between the two countries. And a lot of people have told me that if the United States and other countries had helped those two countries come to some type of resolution, they would be at peace with each other, and this conflict in Somalia really would have wound down, because there are suspicions that Eritrea is backing the Islamic courts as kind of payback to frustrate Ethiopia because of the border issue. So I do think Eritrea is a key piece in this whole equation. All
right. Well, Jeffrey Gettleman and John Prendergast, don't go away. We've got to take a short break here. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the show. We're looking at the ongoing humanitarian and political crisis in Somalia and what seems to have become a forgotten war. And don't forget, we're taking your questions on the program, so you can reach us at the numbers at the bottom of your screen. And the question we're asking is, what can the international community do to improve the situation in Somalia? My guests are from Nairobi, Jeffrey Gettleman, East Africa Bureau Chief of the New York Times, and here in Washington, D.C., John Prendergast of the Enough Project. And John, I just want to get this whole image of the Islamic courts that has been created, particularly to people in the West, in the USA. They are portrayed very much as like an Al-Qaeda, or very much tied up with Al-Qaeda, or a Taliban type of group. And yet there are some of those who say there was a chance to negotiate with the Islamic courts to deal with the moderates who really are not anything of a threat to the West in any way, and that opportunity was missed. What's your view on that?
Absolutely the latter. I think that this is an organic movement within Somalia that rejected the warlordism and clanism that has helped lead Somalia down this path of chaos and anarchy. And certainly there are opportunists within that movement who are purveyors of a very extremist ideology, and there is a cell of Al-Qaeda that is certainly, from all intelligence reports, operational there along the Indian Ocean coast, including docking quite frequently in Somalia. And some of the suspects of the bombings in 1998 against American embassies in Tanzania and Kenya have been resident there. So there's no question there is a kernel of a threat there. But generally, this was an organic movement against the terrible things that were happening in Somalia. I think that the problem with Ethiopia and the United States is that they've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. They've lumped everything together, called it all terrorists, and they've allied themselves with this transitional federal government inside Somalia to go after the terrorists, when much of it is organic resistance to external occupation and a desire for governance that rejects the kind of violence and extortion that has marked the southern part of Somalia now for almost 20 years.
Let's get in a call from Zahur, who's in Somalia. Zahur, what would you like to ask?
I would just like to ask if the international community wants, if the international community recognizes Somaliland as an independent country in the Horn of Africa, do you think it will affect Somalia in a better way or a worse way and make things more worse?
Jeffrey Gettleman, would you tackle that one for us, please? Jeffrey, we just lost your audio there for a second. Let me see if John Prendergast can give us a thought on that before we get back to you.
Yeah, I think what we got here in Somaliland is a genuine effort by the people of that region to assert, on the basis of colonial borders, that they are truly an independent state. Since no country in Africa has yet to recognize Somaliland as an independent state, I mean, it's doubtful that anyone outside of Africa will leapfrog Africa and say, yes, we acknowledge. If it was the case that finally there was a domino effect, one country acknowledges and recognizes Somalia and others, the effect on the South might be positive. One school of thought is that, once seen, the recognition and then the benefits that recognition would bring of an orderly, peaceful democratic entity in the north of the country and seeing the benefits that follow, that maybe that would have a positive impact. The likelier option is that some of the elements in southern Somalia, seeing the benefits taken in the north, would try to disrupt that.
Well, you mentioned the organic growth of the Islamic courts and the insurgency. And this email we got from Paris in France, from Bruno Druski, says, "The Somali crisis is the result of foreign intervention in its internal affairs. Western powers should let Somali groups decide in their own country. Apparently now it seems that the majority of the Somali people want the Islamists to be back in power, so let them take power." Now, I wonder, from your perspective, how strong is that support for the Islamic courts now?
I think it's very strong support for order, a very strong rejection of warlordism, and certainly a uniform opposition to foreign intervention. So what Ethiopia has done with their intervention is they've allowed the Islamist elements to wrap themselves in the flag of nationalism, which has led to an explosive growth in their recruitment. Taking Ethiopia out of the equation, which is an impossible thing to do, but if you did, certainly it would be much less support. So the desire now is to negotiate a deal between the Islamists, as Jeffrey was saying, the Islamists and the transitional federal government, that would allow for an orderly withdrawal of the Ethiopians and some form of elections down the road, which would allow the Somali people to decide what their government should be.
Well, this email that came in from Somalia, from Hassan Abdurrahman Ibrahim, says, "The TFG and its allies are now claiming that they have ousted the ICU, the Islamic courts, but the fact is that the ICU are more dangerous than ever. The humanitarian situation in Somalia is worsening day by day. There are corpses lying on the streets of Mogadishu." Now, we were just talking about how the Islamic courts, are represented to the people. I wonder, where does this leave the young Islamic militants, the Shabab, which to some degree seems to have splintered away from the mainstream Islamic courts in becoming much more radical, much more extreme?
Yeah, there certainly are very great cleavages within the Islamist movement that have occurred in the aftermath of the Ethiopian intervention. And as the Shabab has radicalized and received additional foreign support to promote that radical agenda, they have now been sort of demonized because the United States has placed them on the terrorism list over the last couple of weeks,
which they say has actually boosted their support.
Which often has had that effect throughout the world, and in this case, it certainly has. And so they can claim to be the pointy end of the spear against the American and Ethiopian aggressors, and it just gives them an additional recruiting tool that's problematic. So really, until there's a deal that allows for the Islamists to be part of the larger governing entity within Somalia, the fact that they're outside the tent means they're going to try to torch it and burn it down, and there will be no peace in Somalia.
And I wonder, where does that leave the Somali elders, the clan elders, who to a large degree could have had a big say in what was happening?
Yeah, I think it's so important that the peace talks that are occurring now in Kenya understand that it's not just about the guys with the guns, that re-empowering the traditional society within Somalia and the community structures that for centuries kept Somalia afloat, trade, business, governance, are the structures that must be revalued. And that's going to have to be, that's a tricky process in any, as we saw in Afghanistan, as we've seen in Iraq, is no different in Somalia. It's going to require multifaceted political and diplomatic processes that deal with the guys with the guns, but also deal with the re-empowerment of these elements within society.
Well, let's bring Jeffrey Gettleman back in. We've got our audio back with you. Sorry about that, Jeffrey. I want to ask you, actually, if you would just tackle on, we've got a minute and a half or so left, to tackle where you think these talks might go now, what the next steps might be, the best approach to actually create some progress for the situation in Somalia.
Well, I think people should remember it needs to be an internal solution. There was external intervention in Somalia in the 90s, and it was a disaster. You had almost 30,000, expertly trained U.S. troops, and they got run out of the place by militiamen wearing flip-flops and shooting RPGs. So it's not a question of who's going to come in and rescue Somalia. During the 6 months that the ICU was in charge, there was absolutely no crime and fighting in Mogadishu, which is one of the most dangerous cities on the planet and has been so for the last 17 years, except for those 6 months that the ICU was in control. I was there. You didn't hear any gunshots. You saw people going to the beach. Businesses were opening again. It was like prisoners stepping out into the light. So, and that was purely internal. There were no external forces to speak of that were really helping the ICU police that city. Yeah, there might have been some terrorist links somewhere down the line, but that wasn't affecting the day-to-day law and order that I saw for myself. So I think that's what people have to remember. It has to be worked out by the people on the ground in Mogadishu and the rest of that country.
Jeffrey Gettleman, thank you very much. Great to have you with us there from Nairobi. Sorry about losing you there for a little while. And John Prendergast, thank you very much for being with us here and discussing this. Thank you for joining us on the next